He stood in the middle of a room full of champagne and applause, and he said the one thing he had promised himself he never would. The only woman I've ever wanted is you. Not a stranger, not someone he'd met at a bar. His boss, the billionaire CEO whose signature was on his paycheck. The woman who had given a widowed father with a toddler and a grief-soaked resume a chance when no one else would. The room didn't exist anymore, just the two of them. And the truth he could never take back. This is Ethan Carter's story. If it moves you, stay until the end, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Ethan Carter's life quietly pivoted towards something he couldn't yet name, he was running late. Not dramatically late. Not the kind where you sprint through airport terminals or scream at red lights. Just the small, grinding, 5 minutes behind on everything kind of late that had become the ambient noise of his entire existence since Sophie died. He'd burned his daughter's oatmeal. Again. He'd found Lily's left shoe behind the couch, which meant 10 minutes of searching and one small person melting down on the kitchen floor because the shoe was there. Daddy, right there. Why didn't you look there first? He didn't argue. He never argued with Lily. At 4 years old, she was already the most correct person in his life. By the time he dropped her at Mrs. Patterson's. His neighbor, 72, retired third-grade teacher, the closest thing to a grandmother Lily had ever known, he had exactly 9 minutes to drive 22 minutes to work. He drove fast, not recklessly. Just with the particular focused desperation of a man who understood that showing up late to Langford Development was not something you did twice. The company occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower downtown, clean-lined and severe against the gray October sky. The lobby alone was intimidating. Soaring ceilings, dark marble floors that reflected everything, 2 receptionists who seemed genetically engineered to look like they belonged there. The first time Ethan had walked in for his interview, he'd stood in that lobby for a full 30 seconds before he could make his legs move. That had been 8 months ago. He still felt a version of that feeling every morning. Just quieter now. More manageable. He made it to his desk with 4 minutes to spare. His coworker and the closest thing he had to a friend at the office, Marcus Webb, leaned over from the neighboring workstation without looking up from his screen. "You burned the oatmeal again, didn't you?" "Shut up. There's coffee in the break room. Real coffee. Someone brought a French press." Ethan dropped his bag, loosened his collar, and breathed. "I love this company." Marcus finally looked up, grinning. "You love the coffee. Different thing." Ethan had been hired as a senior architectural designer, a title that, in most firms, came with a degree of creative autonomy and a corner office ambition. At Langford Development, it came with an enormous amount of pressure and a direct line of accountability to projects that reshaped city skylines. He'd earned the position through a portfolio that was, by any honest measure, exceptional. But he knew, and the people who hired him knew, that the position had also come partly through luck, right time, right project, right interview, and partly through Victoria Langford herself. He'd learned afterward that she'd reviewed his portfolio personally before the final decision. That was unusual. Langford Development had a full design team leadership structure, people whose job it was to vet candidates like Ethan, so the CEO didn't have to. But someone had flagged his redesign proposal for a mixed-use community housing complex that integrated accessibility architecture in ways the field rarely bothered to. And Victoria had apparently looked at it herself and said simply, "Hire him." He hadn't known that when he started. He'd found out 3 months in, during a project review, when one of the senior managers mentioned it offhandedly. It had stayed with him. Not as gratitude exactly, more as a weight he kept carrying, a reminder that someone had looked at his work and seen something in it that mattered. He didn't want to waste that. The first time Ethan had a real conversation with Victoria Langford, it was in an elevator. He'd been at the company for about 6 weeks, carrying a cardboard tube of design plans too wide to fit properly under his arm, when the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor and she stepped in. He recognized her immediately. Her face was on the company website. She had a particular way of walking through the office that parted the air differently than everyone else. But he'd never been close to her before. She was shorter than he'd imagined, maybe 5'4". Dark hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless but probably wasn't. A charcoal suit with no jewelry except small gold earrings. She glanced at him, then at the cardboard tube currently threatening to take out the side of the elevator, then back at him. Do you need help with that? No, He shifted the tube. It smacked the wall. I've got it. You definitely don't have it. He laughed. He hadn't meant to, but it came out. Real. A little embarrassed. I really don't. She reached out and took one end of the tube without asking again, holding it steady while he adjusted his grip. They rode up in silence. When the doors opened on his floor, she handed her end back and stepped out ahead of him. Good luck with the plans, she said, already walking. Thank you, he called after her, slightly stupidly. She didn't turn back, but he thought, maybe, there was the edge of a smile. After that, they crossed paths with the particular frequency that seemed designed by some indifferent universe to make professional detachment difficult. Not every day, but enough. She sat in on a project pitch he gave in his third month and asked two questions that rewired the direction of the whole proposal. Not aggressively, not in the way that felt like dismantling, but with the kind of precision that made him realize she understood architecture the way people understand languages they grew up in. Structurally. Intuitively. He stayed late that night and reworked two sections. She stopped him in the hallway the following week. The revised plans for the Harmon Street project. They're good. The load-bearing modification on level 3 was the right call. He stood there for a beat too long. I wasn't sure about it. That's usually how you know it's right, she said, and kept walking. Tate. He didn't let himself think about her that way for a long time. He was careful about it. Deliberately, consciously careful. Not because the feelings didn't exist, he wasn't built for that kind of self-deception, but because he understood, with a clarity that surprised him, how badly it could go. She was his employer. Not just technically, not just bureaucratically, but genuinely. She had pulled his name out of a pile and said yes, and that meant something he wasn't willing to cheapen. And there was Lily. Lily, who had stopped asking where Mommy was about 8 months after Sophie died. Not because she'd forgotten, but because she'd learned, in whatever wordless 4-year-old logic governs the early architecture of grief, that the answer didn't come back different no matter how many times you asked. Lily, who had Sophie's coloring and Ethan's stubbornness, and a laugh that could still stop him cold in the middle of a room. He had made a promise at Sophie's grave, not a dramatic, spoken-aloud promise, just a quiet interior decision, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. That he was going to be enough for his daughter. Whatever that required, he would provide it. She would not grow up feeling like a consolation prize for a life that hadn't worked out. That promise left very little room for anything that might destabilize what he'd built. So he was careful. The celebration was Victoria's idea. The company had just closed a deal that had been 18 months in negotiation. A massive mixed-use development contract with the city that would transform a former industrial waterfront district into a livable, walkable community. It was the kind of project Langford Development had been positioning toward for years, and Ethan's team had played a significant role in the proposal architecture that had won the contract. Victoria sent the announcement company-wide on a Thursday afternoon with a note at the bottom. Dinner on Friday. Everyone who worked this project, reservations at Calder's, 7 o'clock. You've all earned it. Calder's was not the kind of restaurant Ethan usually found himself in. Dark wood, candlelight, wine lists organized by region and vintage. The kind of place where the portions were artistic and the silence between conversations felt intentional. He showed up in the only sport coat he owned that didn't have a design school memory attached to it, found his team already gathered at a long table near the back, and settled in. Victoria was already there. She was at the head of the table, which was both natural and somehow slightly disorienting. Seeing the version of her that existed outside the office. Same composure, same focused quality of attention, but looser, somehow. She'd ordered wine for the table. She was laughing at something someone had said. She looked up when he sat down, and there was a brief, genuine moment of recognition before the professional gloss reasserted itself. Ethan, glad you made it. Wouldn't miss it, he said. He meant it. Dinner moved the way good work dinners move when the pressure is finally lifted. Stories got louder, glasses got refilled, people started to be actual human beings instead of job titles. Ethan talked, laughed, ate food that cost more than his electric bill. He felt something he hadn't felt in a while, a lightness that he didn't entirely trust, but was willing to lean into for one evening. Victoria moved through the table the way a good CEO moves through a team dinner. She spent time at every cluster of conversation, not hovering, but landing, engaging, moving on. When she reached the end of the table where Ethan was sitting with Marcus and two project managers, she pulled out the empty chair across from him and sat down. "Marcus tells me you pushed back hard on the level 2 terrace specifications," she said to Ethan without preamble. He glanced at Marcus, who suddenly found his wine extremely interesting. "The original specs put wind load stress on a section that wasn't rated for it," Ethan said. "I pushed back because it was wrong, not because I wanted to." "That's usually the only valid reason," she said. "Did anyone give you trouble?" "A little." "Anyone specific?" He named a name. She nodded once in a way that meant noted and moved on, but she didn't leave the chair. They talked for a while after that. Not about work exactly, the edges of work, the places where work bleeds into what you actually think about things. She asked him about his design background, about where he'd studied, about what he believed architecture could do that other disciplines couldn't. "It's permanent," he said, thinking while he spoke. "Most things we build, culturally, professionally, they can be revised, dismantled. A building stays. And the people inside it are shaped by the space whether they're conscious of it or not. I think that's either terrifying or important depending on how seriously you take it." She looked at him for a moment. "Which do you take it as?" "Both, usually, about equally." Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not visibly, he'd just learned to notice. "What made you go into architecture specifically?" she asked. "Not design, generally. Architecture." He looked at his glass. "My wife," he said. "Sophie was studying interior design when we met. She was the one who made me think about spaces as places where people actually live. I was more interested in the structures themselves before I met her. She moved me toward the human element." The table around them had moved into its own conversation. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "She passed away," she said. Not tentatively, just directly, the way she said most things. 3 years ago, car accident. He said it the way he always said it now, not without weight, but without the flinch. He'd learned to carry the weight without showing the flinch. "I have a daughter, Lily. She's 4. Victoria nodded. There was something in her expression that wasn't pity. He'd gotten so good at recognizing pity, but something more considered. "That's a lot to carry while also redesigning a city's waterfront." "It keeps me focused," he said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. She looked at him a moment longer, then stood. "Enjoy the rest of the evening, Ethan." Bye. It was later in the night, wine loosened, celebratory, the formal edges of the dinner entirely dissolved, when the conversation happened. He was standing near the bar with Marcus, who had somehow migrated into a debate about the best decade for jazz, when Victoria appeared at his elbow. She had a half-full wine glass and the expression of someone who had successfully navigated a full table's worth of personalities and was allowing themselves one private moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said, and the tone of it was different from dinner, lighter, more casual. "My sister is visiting next month. She's 27, works in environmental consulting. Smart, a little blunt. I was thinking of—" She paused, half smiling. "Would you be open to being introduced?" Ethan looked at her. He understood in that instant, with the particular crystalline clarity that seems to only arrive at the worst possible moments, that if he said sure, he would close a door that he'd been standing in front of for months without ever quite opening it. And he would close it cleanly and professionally, and Victoria Langford would never need to know what he'd spent most of his working hours carefully not thinking about. He also understood, with equal clarity, that he was not apparently going to say sure. He looked at her. He said, "I appreciate that, I do. But He stopped, restarted. "There's someone I already—" He stopped again. Victoria tilted her head a fraction. "Someone you already what?" He had not planned this. He would like the record to reflect that he had genuinely, sincerely not planned this. What came out of his mouth next arrived with the inevitability of something that had been building pressure for 8 months and had simply found the one crack in the wall. "The only woman I've ever wanted to take out to dinner," he said, very quietly, with a steadiness that surprised him, "is you, Victoria." The ambient sound of the bar continued around them. Glasses, laughter, jazz still arguing from the corner where Marcus had been. Victoria didn't speak. She looked at him the way people look at something they weren't expecting to see. Not scandalized, not professionally alarmed, not any of the responses he might have braced for. Just very still, very present. Like she was reading something in a language she recognized but hadn't heard spoken aloud in a long time. Then she exhaled, a small, controlled exhale. "Ethan, I know," he said quickly. "I know, I shouldn't have said it. I understand the situation completely, and I am not expecting—" "Ethan." Her voice was quiet, not sharp, just certain. "Let me finish." He closed his mouth. "I heard you," she said. She glanced briefly at the bar, then back to him. "I don't want you to feel like I'm dismissing what you said. I'm not. But I also can't." She shook her head just slightly. "This is not a conversation we can have here." "I know," he said again. "I'm sorry. I didn't intend—" "Don't apologize for being honest," she said. And something in her voice, something careful and deliberately neutral, made him wonder what exactly it was costing her to hold that neutrality in place. She looked at him for one more second. Then she said quietly, "Good night, Ethan," and turned back toward the room. He stood at the bar for a while after that. Marcus appeared at his elbow. "What was that?" "Nothing," Ethan said. Marcus looked at him. "That was not nothing." "Drop it, Marcus." Marcus dropped it. But he poured Ethan another drink first, which was, all things considered, the most useful thing anyone could have done. He drove home in the kind of silence that isn't peaceful. The city moved past the windows, amber streetlights, late-night traffic, the occasional blur of someone walking somewhere with a destination. He drove by feel, muscle memory navigating while his brain reran the last 40 minutes with the obsessive precision of a man trying to locate the exact moment he'd made a mistake. Except, and this was the thing he kept landing on, kept pressing on like a bruise to see if it still hurt the same way, he didn't entirely feel like it had been a mistake. He felt exposed, unsteady, professionally vulnerable in a way that would probably keep him awake until 4 in the morning. But not wrong. There was something clarifying about having said a true thing, even when the timing was terrible and the context was impossible. He'd spent 3 years saying the correct things, the appropriate things, the things a bereaved husband and careful father was supposed to say. "I'm managing. We're okay. She's doing well. I'm doing well." The truth of the last 8 months was that something had been building in him that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a woman who had looked at his work and said yes before she even met him, and then turned out in person to be exactly as serious and sharp and briefly, unexpectedly human as her work suggested. He was in love with her, not in a reckless way, not even in an urgent way, in the slow geological way that things build in people who have already lost enough to know better than to feel anything casually. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a minute. His phone buzzed. "Mrs. Patterson. Lily had a nightmare around 10, but she's back asleep. All fine now. See you in the morning." He looked at that message for a long time. Lily had a nightmare around 10. He thought about his daughter, 4 years old, waking in the dark in a borrowed bed and navigating back toward sleep. The small, specific courage of children. The way they face things headlong without the adult luxury of avoidance. He told the truth tonight. He hadn't planned it, hadn't wanted to do it badly, had probably made the next week of his professional life significantly more complicated. But he'd said a true thing. And whatever happened now, however Victoria chose to respond, however the professional geography of his life rearranged itself around this new fact, at least that was real. He got out of the car, went inside, checked on Lily, who was asleep with one arm flung out and her blanket on the floor, as always. He put the blanket back over her. She didn't wake up. He stood there for a moment in the dark of her room, listening to her breathe. Then he went to bed. He lay awake until 3:47 a.m., which was, more or less, what he'd expected. Monday morning arrived with its customary indifference to whatever had happened Friday night. Ethan got Lily to Mrs. Patterson's without burning anything. He drove to work. He rode the elevator up, walked to his desk, opened his laptop. The day presented itself with its ordinary demands: email threads, a project deadline, a material specification review that had been pushed twice and couldn't be pushed again. He worked. He didn't see Victoria. He hadn't expected to, necessarily, but there was a particular brand of awareness that came with knowing she was somewhere in the building, 6 floors up, or in a meeting room, or walking through some corridor he wasn't in, that made concentration require more deliberate effort than usual. Marcus came by around 10 with coffee and said nothing beyond, "Here," and Ethan said, "Thanks," and they left it at that. Marcus had a talent for knowing when to let things sit. At 2:14 in the afternoon, Ethan's computer showed a calendar invitation. Project Architecture Review, Wednesday, 3 p.m. Attendees, V. Langford, E. Carter, Design Team A. He stared at it. He accepted. Jashat. Victoria was already in the conference room when he arrived Wednesday. She was reviewing documents at the head of the table. Her posture the same, her attention the same. The room organized the same way it always was when she ran a meeting. 3 other people from his team were already seated. She looked up when he walked in. Direct eye contact, steady, professional. "Ethan," she said, "take a seat." "Thanks," he said, and sat down. That was all. No reference, no shifted energy, no unspoken acknowledgement of Friday, none of the subtle meteorology of avoidance that he'd been half braced for. Just the meeting, proceeding exactly as meetings proceeded. He was impressed by that, and also vaguely humbled by it. The meeting ran 90 minutes. She was sharp, focused, and 2 or 3 times engaged him directly on design decisions with the same interested rigor she always brought to those conversations. He answered each time without stumbling. She moved on. At the end, as the room cleared and he gathered his materials, she said, quietly, not quite looking at him, "You're doing good work, Ethan. The terrace load resolution was well executed." "Thank you," he said. A pause. Barely a second. "See you Thursday for the Harmon Street check-in," she said, and walked out. He stood for a moment in the empty conference room. Then he picked up his folder and headed back to his desk. He didn't stop thinking about her. He'd like to say he did. That professionalism functioned as a reset. That the decision they'd silently mutually made to simply not address Friday operated as a kind of emotional closure. It didn't. It operated instead as a pressure seal. Everything still there, just contained. He drove home, made dinner. Lily told him, at considerable length and with full dramatic commitment, about a fight she'd had with a boy named Trevor at the park, who had taken her stick. "My stick, Daddy, the good one." That does sound like a problem. "I told him it was my stick, and he didn't care." "What did you do?" "I found a better stick." He looked at his daughter, who was eating her macaroni with complete self-possession, entirely satisfied with her own resolution. "Lily," he said, "you are better at this than I am." "I know," she said. "Can I have more?" He gave her more. Later, after she was in bed, he sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and thought about Friday, and about Wednesday, and about the particular quality of Victoria Langford's composure. The way she'd looked at him that Friday night, not scandalized, not cold, just still. The way she'd said, "Don't apologize for being honest," with that careful, neutral voice that he kept returning to, kept reading for something underneath it. He didn't know what it meant. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was simple professionalism, and he was manufacturing subtext because it was easier than accepting that a conversation was finished. Maybe. He'd built a career on reading spaces, understanding how structure and dimension and light affected the people moving through them. He'd learned equally good at reading people, but he'd spent 8 months in proximity to this particular person, and something in the architecture of her response on Friday had not felt like a door closing. It had felt like a door held very carefully, very deliberately, in a position that was neither open nor shut. He sat with that. Didn't push it, couldn't do anything with it anyway. He rinsed his mug, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. Outside, the city kept going, indifferent and reliable as always. Inside, Ethan Carter lay awake, not with dread this time, but with the quiet, difficult awareness of a man who had said a true thing and could not unsay it, and who was no longer entirely sure he wanted to. The week after the dinner at Calder's passed, the way weeks pass when you're trying very hard not to think about something, which is to say, it passed slowly, and the thing you weren't thinking about was always there, sitting just at the edge of everything else. Ethan worked. He worked the way he always worked when life got complicated, which was harder and longer and with more attention than the job strictly required. He came in early. He stayed late on 2 of the 5 days, which meant Mrs. Patterson was putting Lily to bed on those nights, which meant Lily would be dramatic about it in the morning, in that particular 4-year-old way that was equal parts guilt-inducing and genuinely impressive in its commitment to the performance. "You weren't there," Lily informed him on Thursday morning, over cereal she'd decided she no longer liked. "I know. I'm sorry." Mrs. Patterson doesn't do the voice right. The voice for which character? The bear. He had a specific voice for the bear in Lily's current favorite book. He had apparently committed to this bit so thoroughly that a stand-in was now inadequate. "I'll do the bear tonight," he said. "I promise." Lily considered this. "Twice?" "Once. Twice or I won't eat this cereal." He looked at her. She looked at him. She had Sophie's eyes, dark brown, very direct, zero tolerance for bluffing. "Fine," he said. "Twice." She ate her cereal. He drove to work thinking that he was being out-negotiated daily by a 4-year-old, and that Sophie would have found this absolutely hilarious. The thought of Sophie didn't hit the same way it used to. That was one of the things nobody told you about grief, the way it changed texture over time. The first year it was everywhere, soaked into everything, impossible to move through without encountering it. By the second year it had settled into something more specific, more particular. Now 3 years out, it arrived in flashes. Real, still weighted, but survivable. He could think about Sophie laughing without feeling like the floor had dropped out. That was progress, he supposed. Or at least it was something. What he was less sure how to categorize was what he felt every time he walked into Langford Development and understood, somewhere below his rational mind, that Victoria Langford was in the same building. She did not avoid him. That was the thing he hadn't anticipated, or rather, the thing he'd feared she would do and had braced himself for, and then she simply didn't do it. She showed up to the Thursday check-in for the Harmon Street project exactly as she'd said she would. She sat at the end of the table and asked the right questions, and at one point challenged a site drainage decision that Ethan had signed off on, and he disagreed with her challenge, and they went 3 rounds on it in front of the whole team before she said, "Pull the original specifications and we'll revisit Friday," in a tone that meant the conversation was paused, not concluded. He pulled the specifications. He put together a 2-page technical summary of his position. He left it on her assistant's desk Friday morning. Friday afternoon, he got an email from her. 4 lines. "Your drainage analysis is thorough. I'm not fully persuaded on the soil retention rate you're using. I'd want a second opinion from structural. That said, the overall approach is sound. Good work this week." He read it twice. He wrote back, "Agreed on the second opinion. I'll schedule structural for next week. Thank you." He sent it before he could reread it 12 more times. Marcus leaned over from his desk. "You're making a face." "What face?" "The face where something happened and you're pretending nothing happened." "I'm working." "You've been staring at your email for 4 minutes." Ethan closed the email window. "I'm done working. I'm leaving." He stood up, grabbed his coat. "Good night, Marcus." "Good night, man who definitely isn't making a face." They fell into something after that. Ethan didn't have a precise word for it and spent some time trying to avoid the exercise of finding one, because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required deciding what to do about it, and he wasn't ready for that. What it was practically was this. They worked well together. They had always worked well together, but something about the Friday at Calder's had recalibrated the specific frequency at which they operated in each other's orbit. Like a radio dial that had been slightly off station and was now not locked in, not fully clear, but perceptibly closer to the signal it was reaching for. She still challenged his work. He still pushed back. Their professional relationship operated exactly as it always had: direct, rigorous, occasionally tense in the productive way that tension between two people who take their work seriously tends to be. But there were moments. Small things. Civilian things. The kind you'd never be able to point to in isolation and call them anything at all. He'd say something in a meeting and catch her looking at him in a way that lasted a half second too long before she moved on. She'd make a dry observation about a vendor they were both frustrated with and glance at him specifically, in the particular way people glance at the one person in the room they know will understand the joke. He held a door once, not a grand gesture, just a door. And she said thank you, and their hands nearly touched on the door frame, and neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them looked at each other directly for the next 10 minutes. That was the landscape they were living in, not a relationship. Not even a friendship, exactly, because friendship implied a mutual off-duty quality that couldn't exist while she was his employer. Just proximity. Awareness. Two people who had said a true thing and decided, with mutual unspoken consent, to keep showing up anyway. It was not comfortable. He didn't think she was entirely comfortable either. But it was honest, in its own strange way. More honest than pretending the conversation had never happened. He found out about Victoria's professional reputation the way you find out most things at a company, sideways, through other people's conversations, in fragments that assembled themselves into a picture over time. She had taken over Langford Development at 26, after her father's health had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer run the company he'd built from a regional firm into a national one. She'd stepped in with a board that was skeptical, a staff that was uncertain, and a financial structure that had been, according to Marcus, who had been there for it, not exactly a disaster, but uncomfortably close to the radius of one. She had stabilized it in 14 months, not through any single dramatic move, but through a series of decisions that were methodical and sometimes counterintuitive and occasionally unpopular. She'd cut 2 lines of business, hired aggressively in 3 others, restructured the leadership team in ways that produced significant friction and longer-term significantly better results. She was not universally beloved internally. Nobody who made real decisions ever was. There were people at Langford who found her too exacting, too difficult to read, too committed to a standard of performance that didn't leave much room for the normal human approximations of good work. Ethan had heard the complaints. He'd sat in rooms where people expressed their frustrations with the particular freewheeling honesty that comes with a closed door and a shared grievance. He'd mostly stayed quiet in those conversations. Not because he disagreed that she was demanding, he knew she was demanding. He'd been on the receiving end of her exactingness and knew precisely what it felt like to have work you were proud of questioned with the kind of specificity that implied the person questioning it had read it more carefully than you'd expected. He stayed quiet because he thought the people complaining were missing something. The demands weren't arbitrary. They were connected to something she actually cared about. Not abstract excellence, not performance for its own sake, but the specific belief that the built environment mattered and that the company doing the building should be held to a standard that reflected that belief. He'd seen it in the questions she asked, in the projects she pushed back on, in the things she signed off on without hesitation, and the things she sent back for revision with annotations that were precise enough to be actually useful. She was exacting because she was serious. Those weren't the same thing, and not everyone understood the difference. He understood it, which was maybe part of the problem. November arrived with cold mornings and a deadline crunch on the Harmon Street project that pushed the entire team into the particular focused misery of doing a lot of important work in too little time. Ethan was at his desk by 7:30 most days. He ate lunch at his computer more often than not. The design plans went through 4 iterations in 8 days, which was not a pace anyone enjoyed, but which produced, he had to admit, something cleaner and better than what they'd started with. Victoria was in the office constantly during this stretch. He saw more of her than he usually did, passing in hallways, overlapping in the small kitchen on their floor when he came in early, at her desk visible through the glass wall of her office when he walked by to the copy room. She had a habit, when she was deep in something, of pulling the end of her pen against her lower lip and just sitting there thinking in a way that was private and unguarded and that he had never told her he'd noticed. He was aware that noticing that was a problem. He was aware of it and noticed it anyway. One evening in mid-November, he was still at his desk at 7:15 when most of the office had cleared out, finishing a rendering that needed to be ready for a client presentation the next morning. He heard footsteps stop near his desk and looked up. Victoria, coat already on. She paused, looking at his screen. "Client presentation tomorrow?" she said. 8 o'clock. She looked at the rendering. He watched her looking at it. The specific quality of attention she brought to things when she was actually seeing them, not just reviewing them. "The courtyard orientation," she said. "You moved it." 15 degrees east, the original had it shading the ground floor retail from noon onward. "This way you get full light until around 3:30. She nodded slowly. "That'll make a difference for the small business viability of those units." That was the idea. A pause. She looked at him rather than the screen for a moment. "You think about who's going to live in these buildings," she said. Not as a question. "I try to," he said. "It matters more than the rendering looks, usually." She held his gaze for a second. "It does." She shifted her coat. "Go home at a reasonable hour. You're here at 7:15. I'm the CEO. It's a different calculus." But there was the edge of something not quite a smile. "Lily needs you home." He blinked. "You know her name?" "You've mentioned her," Victoria said simply. "More than once." And she walked toward the elevator. He sat at his desk for a moment after she left. Then he turned back to his rendering and worked for another 40 minutes. And when he finally shut his computer down and drove home, he did the bare voice twice without any negotiation. And Lily fell asleep halfway through the second time, and he sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while, just sitting. The thing about an unspoken arrangement is that it requires both people to maintain it simultaneously, and that the maintenance is effortful in ways that accrue interest over time. Ethan was aware, as December approached, that he was spending more emotional energy on the act of not doing anything than the act of not doing anything was theoretically worth. Every professional interaction with Victoria required a layer of management underneath the surface. Not dishonesty exactly, but a constant calibration. Keep it professional. Keep it direct. Don't look at her the wrong way in a meeting. Don't respond to the dry observation aimed specifically at you with more warmth than the situation strictly warranted. Don't read into the half seconds. It was exhausting. Not enough to compromise his work. Not enough to make him want to quit. But present. An ongoing low-grade weather system that required constant monitoring. He talked about none of it. Not to Marcus, who knew something was happening but had, since the night of the dinner, maintained a careful distance from the topic that Ethan was genuinely grateful for. Not to Mrs. Patterson, who was his primary adult human contact outside the office, and who would have been entirely too interested. Not to anyone. He had exactly one conversation that got anywhere near it, and it was with Lily, who did not know she was having it. It was a Sunday afternoon, and they were at the park, Lily on the swings, Ethan pushing her, the November air cold enough to see their breath. Lily had been talking about Mrs. Patterson's cat, which had recently had kittens, and whether they could get a kitten, and Ethan had been explaining, for approximately the 14th time, the complications of kitten ownership in an apartment with a dad who was gone 10 hours a day. "But I would take care of it," Lily said. "You're 4. Almost 5. 5-year-olds also can't take care of kittens alone." Lily swung in silence for a while, considering this. Then, "Are you lonely, Daddy?" He kept pushing. "What made you ask that?" "I don't know." She dragged her feet to slow herself down, which she did when she was thinking seriously. "Mrs. Patterson says sometimes people get lonely and they don't say so." He thought about how to answer this with a 4-year-old and with honesty and without making her feel responsible for something she couldn't fix. "Sometimes," he said finally. "A little, but I have you, so mostly not." "That's nice," Lily said, satisfied. She started swinging again. "We should still get a kitten, though." "We're not getting a kitten." "Okay," she said, in the tone that meant the conversation was tabled but not closed. He pushed her higher, and she shrieked in the way that meant she wanted more, and the cold air moved through the park around them, and he thought, "A little. Sometimes." "Yes, won't." The first Friday of December, Ethan arrived at the office to find a meeting on his calendar he hadn't expected. One-on-one performance review, V. Langford, 10 a.m. Conference room B. He stared at it. One-on-ones with the CEO were not unusual at the company. Victoria ran them periodically with senior staff as part of a review cycle. He'd had one at the 6-month mark, run by the design team director with Victoria's input. This would be his first direct one-on-one with her since Calder's. He showed up at 9:58 with his project notes and a careful professional neutrality he'd been constructing since roughly 7:30 that morning. She was already there, coffee in front of her, a file folder, which he assumed contained his review documentation. She looked, as she nearly always looked, like she had been ready for this meeting for considerably longer than he had. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She opened the folder. She walked him through the review the way reviews get walked through, methodically, starting with project performance, moving through technical contribution, peer feedback, and forward-looking objectives. It was thorough. It was fair. The feedback was specific in the places where it was critical and specific in the places where it was positive, which he found more useful than vague praise, even when the vague praise would have been more comfortable. He was quiet through most of it, asking questions where he had them, nodding where she was right. When she finished the formal portion, she closed the folder. There was a brief pause, not an uncomfortable one, just a pause. "You've had a strong first year," she said. "The Harmon Street contributions specifically were above what I expected from someone 8 months in." "Thank you." I mean that as genuine feedback, not encouragement. "I know the difference," he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted slightly. Not much, just enough to move the room from performance review into something slightly less structured. "How are you doing?" she said. "Actually," he paused. "Professionally? Well, I think the work is—" "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the same directness she brought to everything, but underneath the directness, something that was interested. Careful, not professionally interested. The other kind. "I'm managing," he said. "Lily's good. The work helps." "Does it get lonely?" she said. "Doing all of it alone." He thought about the park. "A little?" "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes." She nodded. She looked down at her coffee cup. It was the most unguarded he'd seen her in a professional setting, the quality of someone who had asked a question they weren't entirely sure they should have asked and were now deciding what to do with the answer. "Victoria," he said quietly. She looked up. "Are we going to talk about what I said at Calder's?" A breath. She set her coffee cup down. "I wasn't planning to. But, she said, and stopped. He waited. "What you said?" she started, carefully. I don't want you to think I ignored it because it didn't land." "What does that mean?" She met his eyes directly. "It means it landed." A pause. "That's the problem." The room was very quiet. The building noise continued around them. The ordinary sounds of a building full of people going about their ordinary business. But the conference room felt sealed off from all of it. "You're my employer," Ethan said. "Yes." "And this company depends on the trust of the people in it," she finished. "I know. I've thought about it. Considerably more than I would like to admit." He was quiet. 240 people work at this company," Victoria said. "The decisions I make, including the personal ones, have downstream effects on all of them. That's not an abstraction for me. That's something I think about every time I make a call that feels even slightly self-interested." "I know," he said. "I understand that." "Do you?" She said it without sharpness, genuinely asking. "Yes," he said. "I wouldn't have wanted to work here if that wasn't who you were." That stopped her. For a moment she looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, something complicated, something that moved through her and settled. "That makes this harder," she said quietly. "I know." "I need you to understand something," Victoria said. She was choosing her words with the same precision she brought to the things that mattered most to her. "What I feel, what I may feel, can't be something that happens inside this company, in this structure, with this dynamic between us. I won't let it. Not because I don't. She stopped, restarted. Not because the feeling isn't real, but because I know what it looks like from the outside, and I know what it does to the people who watch two people in our position stop being professional about it. And I care about this company and the people in it more than I care about what I want on any given day. Ethan listened, all of it. I hear you, he said. I need you to actually hear me, she said, not just tell me you do. Victoria, he leaned forward slightly. I took this job because you looked at my work and said yes when my resume made it very easy to say no. I have a daughter who is not going to remember her mother. I have a job that is the most professionally meaningful thing I've had in my career. I am not going to blow any of that up. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm not expecting anything. What I said at Calder's, I said it because I couldn't not say it anymore. That's all. I'm not handing you a problem to solve. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said, quietly. Okay, he said. Another pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, just weighted with the specific gravity of two people who had said more true things to each other in the past 3 weeks than most colleagues said in a career, and who were now returning by mutual agreement to the ordinary world. She picked up her folder. Your project objectives for Q1 are outlined on page 4. I'd like a preliminary draft of the Westfield proposal by January 15th. I'll have it by the 10th, he said. She nodded, stood. That would be useful. She walked out. He sat in the conference room for about 2 minutes, not moving. Then he gathered his notes, stood, and went back to his desk. Marcus looked up. How'd the review go? Fine, Ethan said. Good, actually. You're making the face again. I don't have a face, Marcus. Everyone has a face. Ethan sat down and opened his laptop. The Westfield proposal. You have your preliminary site analysis? Sent it last week. Good, I'm going to need it January 10th. Marcus blinked. The deadline is the 15th. I moved it. You don't have the authority to... I have the authority to impose an internal deadline on my own team 5 days before the external one. Ethan looked at his screen. January 10th, Marcus. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, what happened in that review? Work happened, Ethan said, like it always does. He opened the Westfield file. He stared at it for a full minute before he was actually seeing it. Then, because the work was what it had always been, the thing that was real, the thing he could do, the structure underneath the feeling, he started. December moved. The way December moves in a city with real winters, with a particular determination, gray and committed, the light failing earlier every day. Ethan put up Lily's holiday decorations with her on the first Saturday of the month, which was an experience that involved significant negotiation over the placement of a ceramic reindeer she'd named Gerald, who she was adamant should be by the window so he can see outside. Gerald went by the window. He bought a small tree. Lily decorated the bottom half, which was as high as she could reach. He did the top. The result was a tree with a very dense bottom quarter and a sparser upper 3/4 that had the honest, asymmetrical quality of things decorated by children, which he had come to prefer to anything that looked coordinated. He took a photo of it. He didn't know why he took the photo until he looked at it. Lily beaming in front of the tree, Gerald visible in the window behind her, the whole thing imperfect and warm and entirely theirs. And thought, with a clarity that was both simple and somewhat difficult, this is what I have. This is what matters. It wasn't nothing. It was, by any honest accounting, quite a lot. He put his phone in his pocket and helped Lily find the star for the top of the tree. At the office, the work continued. He and Victoria maintained the arrangement they'd settled into. Professional, direct, occasionally almost warm in the way that their working relationship had always had, within it a warmth that neither of them had invented in response to Calder's. It had been there from the elevator, from the first time she'd looked at his work and asked a question that told him she'd actually read it. He did good work. She noticed the good work. They disagreed about 2 things in December and were right about 1 each, which seemed roughly fair. He handed in the Westfield preliminary on January 9th, 1 day ahead of his own deadline, which Marcus noted with an expression of resigned awe. Victoria sent a note. Strong start on Westfield. The phased access approach is exactly right. I have questions about Section 3.2. Can you walk me through the reasoning? He wrote back, Of course, tomorrow works. She replied, Tomorrow works. He put his phone face down on his desk and looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and started drafting the notes for the Section 3.2 walkthrough, because that was the thing in front of him, and the thing in front of him was what he had. That was the arrangement. That was the deal they'd made without ever quite saying so. That what they felt and what they did about it were 2 separate geographies, and they were going to live in the second one, and the first one was going to have to wait. He didn't know how long he could maintain it. He suspected, from the quality of the silence at the end of their conference room conversation, that she was asking herself the same question. But for now, there was work. There was Lily. There was a ceramic reindeer named Gerald by the window. It was enough to be going on with. January delivered on every promise December's gray skies had made. Cold that had teeth. Mornings where the car took 2 tries to start and the windows fogged the moment you breathed. Ethan had learned, in the years since Sophie died, that January had a particular quality of difficulty. Not dramatic, not acute, just long. The month had a way of making everything feel heavier than it actually was, as though winter had decided that endurance was the only thing worth testing. He was managing. That was the honest word for it. Managing, which was not the same as thriving and not the same as falling apart, but occupied a functional middle ground that he had learned to respect. The Westfield proposal consumed most of his working hours through the first 3 weeks. The Section 3.2 walkthrough with Victoria had run long. Nearly 2 hours in the conference room, working through the phased access logic with the kind of granular back and forth that was occasionally frustrating and consistently productive. She'd found a gap in his pedestrian flow analysis that he'd missed, and he'd found a structural assumption in her access model that didn't account for the site's grade differential. They'd fixed both. At the end of the meeting, she'd looked at the revised schematic on the table between them and said, That's better, with the particular satisfaction of someone who found the process of getting to better genuinely worthwhile rather than just a means to an end. He agreed. He told her so. She'd gathered her materials and stood, and for just a second, in the space between the end of the work and the beginning of whatever came after it, she'd looked at him with something unscripted, something that arrived before the professional composure could reassert itself. He didn't name it. He let it pass. That was the practice they'd settled into. You let the moments pass. You did the work. You went home and did the other work of being a father, which was different but equally demanding, and you didn't let yourself sit too long in the space between the two. He'd gotten reasonably good at it. Then, on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January, his phone rang at 6:47, and his brother's name was on the screen, and his brother never called at 6:47, and Ethan knew before he answered that the morning was going to go in a direction he hadn't planned for. "Danny," he said. "It's Mom," his brother said. Correct. His mother's name was Carol. She was 61 years old, lived alone in the house she and Ethan's father had bought 30 years ago in a suburb 40 minutes south of the city, and had been, as far as Ethan had known, in reasonable health. She walked, she gardened, she complained about her knees but had never been to the doctor for them because she didn't trust doctors who were too young to know anything. What Danny told him on the phone was that Carol had been having symptoms for several weeks: fatigue, shortness of breath, a pain in her chest that she'd attributed with characteristic stubbornness to stress and poor sleep. She hadn't told either of her sons. She had instead driven herself to urgent care on Monday morning when the pain became impossible to rationalize away, and been transferred by ambulance to the hospital, and was now in a cardiac care unit with a diagnosis that included 2 words: significant blockage, that made the rest of the sentence difficult to process in any orderly way. "She didn't tell anyone," Ethan said. "She didn't want to worry us." "She's in cardiac care, Danny." "I know, Ethan." He sat on the edge of his bed. Lily was still asleep. The apartment was quiet in the specific way apartments are quiet at 6:48 in the morning when you are holding information that has just reorganized the weight of everything. "How bad?" he said. Danny's pause was answer enough before the words were. "They're recommending surgery, a bypass. They want to move quickly. They said sooner is better given the degree of blockage. Another pause. She's stable right now, but, Ethan, I'll be there this afternoon. You have work? I'll be there this afternoon, he said again. He put the phone down. He sat for a moment longer than he probably should have, staring at the floor. Then he got up, checked on Lily. Still asleep, one arm out, Gerald the reindeer having been relocated from the living room to her nightstand sometime in the past 2 weeks, and went to the kitchen and stood in front of the coffee maker and could not, for approximately 90 seconds, remember how to use it. Then he remembered. He made coffee. He called Mrs. Patterson. He explained in the calm voice he used when he needed Lily to understand something wasn't going to be ordinary, and Mrs. Patterson said, "Go. I'll have her this afternoon. You call me when you know more," with the matter-of-fact warmth that was her particular gift. He emailed his team lead. He opened his laptop and started a brief to his team on the Westfield proposal status so they could proceed without him if the day extended. Then he opened an email to Victoria. He stared at the blank composition window for a moment. He typed, "Victoria, I need to take personal time today and possibly tomorrow. Family medical situation. I've briefed the team on Westfield status and Chen has everything needed to proceed. I'll be reachable by phone for anything urgent. I apologize for the short notice." He hit send. He did not wait for a reply. He showered, got dressed, kissed Lily, who had woken up and was standing in the hallway looking uncertain, told her he had to visit Grandma Carol and that Mrs. Patterson would be with her, and drove 40 minutes south in the gray January morning to the hospital where his mother was waiting. Carol Carter was smaller in the hospital bed than she was in real life. That was the thing that got him. Walking into that room and seeing the particular way illness diminished people not in their spirit, but in their physical presence, as though the body pulled inward around the effort of being unwell. She looked at him when he came in and said immediately, "I knew Danny was going to call you." "Hi, Mom. You didn't need to come. You're in cardiac care." "I'm stable." She said it like it was a reasonable counterargument. He sat in the chair beside her bed. She looked tired. The monitors beside her made their small, constant sounds. She had an IV in her arm, and she was looking at it with the expression of someone who found medical equipment personally offensive. "Tell me exactly what they said," he told her. She told him. She was precise about it, which was characteristic. She'd always had that quality, a kind of factual directness that Danny had inherited, and Ethan had not quite, though he'd spent years trying. 2 blockages, 1 significant, 1 severe. Bypass surgery recommended within the week. Recovery would be 6 to 8 weeks minimum. 6 to 8 weeks, Ethan said. "I'll be fine." "Of course you will. I'm calculating logistics, not catastrophizing." She looked at him with something that was almost affection, but arrived through the particular filter of their relationship, which had always been less openly warm and more adjacent to warmth. They were not a family of easy declarations. They showed up. That was the thing they did, and it meant something. "Where's Lily?" she said. "With Mrs. Patterson." "She shouldn't miss you too much." "She's fine, Mom. She's 4. She's resilient." All the same. Carol shifted slightly. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." "Why didn't you?" A pause. "You have enough." He looked at his mother. I have enough." "You're doing all of it alone, Ethan. You work. You raise that child. She stopped. "I didn't want to be another thing you had to carry." He didn't say anything for a moment because the honest response to that was complicated and the hospital room was not the place for it. Instead, he said, "You're not a thing I have to carry. You're my mother. That's different." She made a small sound that wasn't agreement but wasn't argument either. It was the sound of someone who had been given a response they recognized was true but couldn't quite accept. "Get some rest," he told her. "I'm going to talk to the doctor." The doctor was a cardiologist named Dr. Reyes, who was thorough and direct and young enough that Carol would have objected to on principle. She walked Ethan through the imaging, the proposed surgical approach, and the expected timeline. The surgery itself was the most urgent matter. She was confident in the procedure, and the hospital's cardiac team was strong. What she said afterward was the part Ethan stood in the hallway thinking about for a long time. "The recovery will require support," Dr. Reyes said. She'll need in-home care for the first few weeks. She can't be alone, can't drive, can't manage stairs without assistance initially. After that, cardiac rehab, which is a commitment in itself. And the financial piece, she paused. Has she looked into her coverage? Ethan said he didn't know. Dr. Reyes referred him to the patient services office and gave him a card. He sat in the patient services office for 40 minutes. He came out with a clear picture. His mother's insurance covered the surgery. The surgery was not the problem. The problem was the aftercare, the in-home nursing support during recovery, the cardiac rehab program, the follow-on appointments, the medications, all of it adding up over weeks to a number that did not comfortably fit inside his mother's fixed income or inside Ethan's budget, which was functional but not flexible. He had a daughter, a modest apartment, a car that had needed new brakes in October and would probably need more attention in spring. He had a savings account that he'd been building slowly and carefully for 2 years. Lily's future, his mother's emergencies, the ordinary disasters of a life without a partner. He drove home that evening and sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and his mother's documents and worked through the numbers the way he always worked through things, methodically, honestly, without inflating the optimistic column. Danny could contribute something, but Danny had 3 kids and a mortgage in a different city and was not sitting on excess either. When he'd finished the calculation, he looked at it for a while. It was manageable. Just, if nothing else went wrong, if the recovery didn't extend beyond the projected timeline, if Lily didn't need anything unexpected, if the car held, if was doing a lot of work in that sentence. He closed the laptop. He went to check on Lily, who was asleep, who had drawn a picture at Mrs. Patterson's that was propped on the nightstand next to Gerald, a drawing that appeared to be of a cat, though Lily had labeled it Lily and Dad in large wavering letters, which made the cat interpretation somewhat less certain. He smiled at it despite himself. He went to bed and lay awake doing math until past midnight, which was its own kind of exhausting. He told no one at work about the specifics. He came back to the office on Thursday, caught up on what he'd missed, and pushed forward on Westfield with the particular focused efficiency of a person who has decided that work is the thing they can control and is going to control it as tightly as possible. Marcus noticed something was wrong on the first day back. He said nothing about it. He brought coffee. He handled a vendor call that was technically Ethan's responsibility without being asked. These were the ways Marcus communicated concern, indirectly, practically, without requiring a conversation that Ethan wasn't going to have. He appreciated it in a way that he knew he'd never fully articulate. Victoria sent a brief email on Thursday afternoon. Hope the family situation is resolving. Let me know if there's anything the company can accommodate from a scheduling standpoint. It was professional. It was the correct professional response. He wrote back, "Thank you. Managing fine. Westfield on track." That was the extent of it. The surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. Ethan drove down Sunday afternoon and stayed overnight at the house, sleeping in his old room, which Carol had kept exactly as it was when he left for college, in a way that was either touching or slightly unsettling depending on how you felt about being 20 again. He drove her to the hospital at 5:30 Monday morning. He sat with her until they took her back, and she held his hand for approximately 3 seconds before releasing it, which for Carol Carter was the emotional equivalent of a significant declaration. He sat in the waiting room for 4 hours. He answered work emails. He reviewed a specification document. He drank terrible coffee from the family waiting room coffee maker, which appeared to have been manufactured before he was born. Danny arrived at the 2-hour mark, harried from the drive, apologetic, and sat next to him, and they were quiet together in the way brothers who don't talk enough are quiet together. Not uncomfortably, but with the awareness of all the things that don't get said regularly enough being present in the silence. "She's going to be okay," Danny said at around hour 3. "I know," Ethan said. "I mean it. I know you mean it. I believe it. I'm just also sitting here." Danny nodded. He understood that. The sitting here part, the being in the room where the thing is, happening part, was its own necessary and unreplaceable act regardless of outcome. Dr. Reyes came out at the 4-hour and 20-minute mark with the particular composure of a surgeon who has learned to deliver news without allowing her face to preview it. She told them, successful, complication-free. Carol was in recovery and would be moved to her room within the hour. Ethan let out a breath that he realized, as he let it out, had been held for approximately 4 days. "Thank you," he said. Dr. Reyes nodded. "The hard part is the next 6 weeks," she said. "Not dramatic, just slow and consistent." "We know," Ethan said. "We'll be here." Hot. The slow and consistent part was harder than the acute part. That was something he'd known intellectually, and now knew in the direct bone-level way you know things you've lived through. The in-home nursing care they could access through insurance ended after 10 days. After that, it was family. Danny came for the first week of the follow-on period, which helped enormously, and then had to return to his family and his job. After that, it was Ethan, driving 40 minutes south 3 evenings a week after work, and spending Saturdays at his mother's house, managing her medication schedule, making sure she was eating properly, helping her with the cardiac rehab exercises, driving her to appointments that she attended with the resigned cooperation of someone who has accepted that recovery is mandatory, even when it's inconvenient. It restructured everything. His mornings were already tight. Now his evenings had a second destination built in, which meant Mrs. Patterson was covering 3 evenings a week, which meant Ethan was paying Mrs. Patterson considerably more than their previous arrangement, which Mrs. Patterson had not asked for, but which he had insisted on because he was not the kind of person who took advantage of kindness without compensating it. The financial picture he'd worked out at his kitchen table began, slowly, to become more complicated. His mother's rehab program wasn't fully covered. The specialist follow-up wasn't covered. The medication adjustment she needed in week 3, an additional prescription the original plan hadn't accounted for, wasn't cheap. None of it was catastrophic in isolation. Together, running simultaneously, they created a pressure that was constant and low-grade, and that he managed without talking about, because talking about it didn't fix any of it. And he didn't want Lily to feel the weather of it. He was tired. He was more tired than he'd been since the first year after Sophie, which was a particular kind of tired that came from running 2 lives with the resources of one. He handled it the way he handled most things, by narrowing his focus to the immediate task, by not looking too far ahead at the full distance remaining, by taking it in the same increments his mother was taking her recovery. One day, then the next. He was good at this. He'd been doing it for 3 years. That didn't make it light. It just made it possible. At the office, he didn't miss a deadline. That was the thing, and he was aware it said something about him that he wasn't entirely sure was healthy. He simply did not miss the work deadlines. The Westfield preliminary was submitted complete and on time. The Harmon Street final sign-off was completed. He showed up, he delivered, he did the work at the standard the work required. He looked from the outside like a man who was managing fine. It was Marcus who saw through it first, which was more or less inevitable. They were working late on a Thursday, mid-February, a deliverable that needed to go to a client by 9 the following morning. And the office had emptied around them, and Marcus was reviewing his section, and Ethan was on his 3rd correction pass of the structural summary. When Marcus said, without looking up, "My aunt had a bypass 2 years ago," Ethan looked up. "What?" "Bypass surgery, 2 years ago. My mom's older sister." He still wasn't looking up from his screen. "The recovery is brutal. Not the surgery itself. That part's almost easier because it's happening and then it's done. It's the 6 weeks after." Ethan was quiet. "My cousin was handling most of it alone," Marcus continued in the same even tone. "Working full-time, driving out there 3-4 times a week. He looked exactly like you look right now, for about 2 months. I'm fine, Marcus. You've had the same coffee on your desk since 2 o'clock. You always finish your coffee. You've also reread that page 4 times and you're not seeing it." Ethan looked at his coffee. He looked at the page. Both observations were accurate. "My mother had surgery 3 weeks ago," he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It came out with the resignation of something that had been under containment pressure for too long. Marcus nodded slowly. "Is she okay?" "She will be. Surgery went well. Recovery is—" He paused. "It's a process. Are you handling the aftercare?" "Mostly." Marcus looked at him directly. "Is there anything you need that you're not going to ask for?" It was such a precise question. The specific formulation of it, that you're not going to ask for, made it impossible to deflect the way he'd deflected everything else. Because of course there were things. The problem wasn't that the things didn't exist. The problem was that he didn't ask. I don't know, he said honestly. Marcus nodded. Okay. He turned back to his screen. For what it's worth, there are programs. The hospital should have patient services resources that cover exactly this kind of situation. Financial support, care coordination, sometimes rehab subsidies. My cousin's wife found 3 of them that helped. I can send you what they used if you want. Ethan looked at him. Yeah, he said after a moment. Yeah, that would help. I'll send it tonight. They went back to work. Neither of them said anything else about it. The deliverable was finished by 11, and Marcus left first, and Ethan drove home through the February dark, more tired than usual, but fractionally, less alone with it than he'd been that morning. The resources Marcus sent were real. Ethan spent a Saturday morning going through them. Patient support programs, nonprofit care coordination services, hospital-affiliated financial assistance pathways that he hadn't known to look for because he hadn't known to look. His mother's situation qualified for 2 of them. The application processes were bureaucratic and required documentation and patience, but they were there, and they covered a meaningful portion of what he'd been carrying on his own. He spent that Saturday afternoon at his mother's house, helping her with her exercises and watching the particular grudging determination with which she approached her rehabilitation. Carol Carter did not like being limited, and she was fighting her recovery with the same stubbornness with which she'd approached everything else in her life, which was, at minimum, useful. You look better, she told him, which was possibly the most backhanded compliment in her repertoire. I found some support resources, he said, for the care costs. She looked at him. What kind of resources? Programs, patient assistance. I should have looked earlier. He paused. Why didn't you tell me about any of this months ago? The symptoms. She made the sound that meant she was not going to engage with that question directly. He let it go. She knew the answer. He knew the answer. Some things were understood without being relitigated. He drove home that evening with Lily in the back seat. He'd brought her along, and she'd sat next to Carol on the couch and read her the Bear Book with the wrong voice, which Carol had listened to with more patience than she applied to most things, which told him something. Lily had fallen asleep in the car by the time they hit the highway, the way kids fall asleep in cars, completely, suddenly, like a switch had been thrown. He drove in the dark with his sleeping daughter and the quiet hum of the road, and he thought about what Dr. Reyes had said. The hard part is slow and consistent. He was in the slow and consistent part. He knew how to be in the slow and consistent part. He had been doing it, in one form or another, for 3 years. What was different this time, what he kept noticing, kept turning over, was that he didn't feel entirely alone in it. Marcus had noticed. Marcus had sent the resources without being asked, in the specific way that said, I see you, and I'm not going to make it weird. His mother's patient services coordinator had been practical and efficient, and had treated him like someone who was navigating a complicated situation rather than someone to be managed. Even Mrs. Patterson had restructured her schedule without complaint, had started having dinner ready for Lily on the evenings Ethan ran late, had slipped a casserole inside his door one Tuesday with a note that said only for when you don't feel like cooking. He was not entirely alone in it. That was, he realized, pulling into his parking space with Lily still asleep in the back, not a small thing. He found out what Victoria had done by accident. It was late February. His mother was 7 weeks post-surgery, cleared for full cardiac rehab, her color better, her stubbornness operating at what the family recognized as near normal capacity. The financial support programs had relieved enough of the pressure that the numbers, while not comfortable, were no longer something he was running in the back of his mind at 2 a.m. He was at the hospital for his mother's rehab consultation. Not strictly necessary for him to attend, but he was there. When the patient services coordinator, a woman named Janet, who had been practical and kind throughout the process, mentioned something in passing. The referral came through your company's EAP partnership, Janet said, reviewing something on her screen. Langford Development's Extended Care Coordination Program. That's actually how we had the support pathway flagged for your case. The HR liaison had already initiated the documentation. Ethan looked at her. "I'm sorry. What?" Janet looked up. "The Employee Assistance Program referral. It came through about 10 days before you reached out to us directly. We had your case in our system already." He sat with that for a moment. 10 days before I reached out. Yes. She checked her screen. January 23rd. He ran the timeline in his head. He had emailed Victoria on January 21st, the brief professional note about taking personal time for a family medical situation. He had not given details. He had said family medical situation, and I'll be reachable by phone, and I apologize for the short notice. January 23rd. 2 days later, she had, without telling him, without making it about herself, without doing anything that required him to acknowledge it or feel indebted to it, quietly initiated a support pathway through the company's employee assistance resources, so that when he eventually found his way to patient services, the path was already partly cleared. He sat in the patient services office for a moment after Janet went back to her screen. "Is everything all right?" Janet asked. "Yes," he said. "Everything's fine. Thank you." He meant both things. He drove back to the city in the gray February afternoon, and he thought about Victoria Langford, and about the precise, considered way she had managed to help him without making him feel helped, without making it something he had to respond to or acknowledge or navigate, without making it a gesture that cost him any of the dignity he would have lost if she'd offered him something directly. She'd just cleared the path, quietly, from a distance, in the specific way that was characteristic of how she did nearly everything, not with visible effort, but with the kind of care that only showed up when you looked at the results. He thought about what he'd told Marcus months ago, when Marcus had asked about the face he was making. Nothing. He thought about what he'd said to Victoria in the conference room in December. "I'm managing." He thought about the fact that she had listened to "I'm managing" and understood it for what it actually was, which was, "I won't ask. So don't make me ask." And she hadn't made him ask. He pulled into the parking garage. He sat in the car for a minute. The building rose above him with its clean glass lines and its ordinary business of people going about their days inside it. He'd spent a long time thinking about what he felt for her as something to be contained, a feeling to manage, to hold at the correct distance, to not let interfere with the professional geometry of his life. He still believed everything they'd said to each other in December. The structural reality hadn't changed. She was still his employer. The company still depended on the integrity of its leadership. The imbalance between them was still real. He hadn't been wrong about any of that. But sitting in the parking garage, holding the piece of information that she had done something kind for him in the most careful possible way, he understood something new, or understood something old in a new way. It wasn't admiration, what he felt. It wasn't the specific dazzle that comes from proximity to someone accomplished and certain and visibly good at everything they do. It was something that had grown in a different direction, from a different root. It was the recognition that came from watching someone be thoughtful. Actually thoughtful. Not as a performance, not as a strategy, but because that was how they were built. He got out of the car. He went upstairs. He sat at his desk. Marcus looked at him and then looked carefully back at his screen, which was the correct thing to do. Ethan opened a blank document. He stared at it for a moment. Then he typed, "Westfield Phase 2, Structural Proposals." And he went to work, and the afternoon moved forward the way afternoons do. And he didn't say anything to anyone about what he'd learned in the patient services office. But he carried it home with him that night, and he was still carrying it when he put Lily to bed, and when he sat at his kitchen table later with the quiet around him and the city outside his window, and when he finally turned out the light. Some things you receive without knowing how to respond to them. Not because you don't feel the weight of it, but because the weight itself is the thing that tells you what kind of thing you've been given. He felt the weight of it. He'd figure out the rest. He didn't bring it up. That was the decision he made, somewhere between the parking garage and his kitchen table that February night, that he was not going to walk into Victoria's office and tell her he knew what she'd done. Not because it didn't matter. Because it mattered too much to handle wrong. And he didn't trust himself to handle it right inside the current geography of their relationship, where everything they said to each other had to pass through the filter of what they couldn't say. So he carried it quietly, the way he'd been carrying most things for most of the past year, and he went back to work, and March arrived and moved through its paces with the particular momentum of a quarter with real deadlines in it. His mother completed cardiac rehab in the second week of March. Dr. Reyes cleared her for normal activity with a short list of ongoing restrictions that Carol received with visible relief and immediately began testing the boundaries of. She drove herself to the grocery store on the first day she was cleared to drive. She called Ethan to tell him, with a satisfaction that was almost competitive. "You called to tell me you went to the grocery store," he said. "I drove myself to the grocery store," she corrected. "There's a difference." "There is," he agreed. "I'm glad." A pause on her end, the specific pause that meant she was about to say something she'd been working up to. "You managed this well," she said. "All of it." "I know it wasn't easy." Coming from Carol Carter, that was a significant thing to say. He understood the weight of it. "We managed it," he said. "Danny helped. Mrs. Patterson helped. There were programs that helped." "But you found them," she said, "and you showed up, every time." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said, "Take it easy this week anyway, okay? The clearance doesn't mean you sprint." She made the sound that meant she'd heard him and was going to make her own decisions about pacing. He accepted this as the best available outcome. He hung up and sat for a moment, the particular pressure that had been running underneath everything since January, not gone, but released, like a long-held breath finally let out. His mother was on the other side of it. The finances were stabilized. Lily was fine, was thriving, had recently made a friend at preschool named B, who figured in her daily narratives with the narrative weight of a major character. Things were, by any honest measure, better. He was aware of what he was going to have to do next. Ahmed said he'd been aware of it since the parking garage, actually, since he'd sat in the car with the February light failing around the building and understood something about Victoria Langford that he hadn't been able to articulate before. Not because the feeling was new, but because it had finally clarified into something he could name without flinching. What he felt for her wasn't going away. He'd given it months of professional distance and a family medical crisis and enough exhaustion to dull most things, and it hadn't gone anywhere. It had just sat there, patient, in the way that things sit when they're actually true rather than just acute. But the structural problem remained. She was his employer. He was her employee. Everything they'd said to each other in December, 240 people, this company, this dynamic, none of that had changed. He wasn't going to walk into her office and reopen that conversation just because he'd had an epiphany in a parking garage. That wasn't how this worked. He understood that clearly. What he didn't know how to do was continue indefinitely in the current arrangement, which had the quality of a temporary measure that had been extended past its reasonable lifespan. Temporary measures, in his professional experience, had a tendency to become permanent by default if you didn't actively decide otherwise. He didn't want this to become permanent by default. He didn't have a solution. He had a clear picture of the problem and no obvious architecture for solving it, which was an uncomfortable place to be for someone who built things for a living. He went back to work. He was good at going back to work. The restructuring announcement came from the board on a Tuesday morning in the first week of April, delivered via company-wide email at 8:15 before most people had finished their first coffee. Ethan read it twice. The language was corporate and measured: strategic expansion, operational evolution, independent divisional structure. But the substance was clear. Langford Development was separating two of its major business lines into semi-independent divisions with their own leadership structures, reporting to the board through the CEO, but operating with significant autonomy. The residential development arm and the commercial and civic projects arm, which had always functioned as departments within a unified company, were being restructured as distinct entities within the larger organization. And attached to the announcement was a preliminary leadership framework. The commercial and civic division, Ethan's work, the Harmon Street project, the Westfield proposal, the kind of architecture that shaped public space, was listed with a position at the top of its leadership structure that had not previously existed. Managing Director, Commercial and Civic Division. Appointment to be confirmed following board ratification. His phone buzzed 8 minutes later. "Marcus, are you reading what I'm reading?" He was reading it. His desk phone rang. His team lead asking if he'd seen the announcement. He said yes. She said there was a department meeting scheduled for 2 o'clock. He said he'd be there. He put the phone down. He looked at the email again. He was not going to let himself assume. The position wasn't named, wasn't confirmed, wasn't his until it was his. He'd been in professional situations before where he'd read signals correctly and been wrong, and in situations where he'd been more cautious than the situation warranted. He was going to do his job today and attend the 2 o'clock meeting and not construct a narrative around something that had not yet been stated directly. He lasted about 40 minutes before going to get more coffee and running directly into Victoria in the small kitchen on their floor. She was pouring coffee. She looked up when he came in. There was something in her expression, not quite neutral, not quite anything else. That specific quality of careful composure she wore when she was managing more than she was showing. "You've seen the announcement," she said. "Just now." She nodded. She set the coffee pot down. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which in the small kitchen with the morning light coming through the one window was both unremarkable and, in the context of their particular history, somewhat charged. "There's a 2 o'clock," he said. "I know, I'm running it." He poured his coffee. She didn't leave. He wasn't sure what that meant, so he didn't try to interpret it. "Is there anything you want me to know before the 2 o'clock?" he asked directly. She looked at him. "The board ratification is Thursday," she said. "Appointments will be confirmed Friday." "Okay." "The framework is solid," she said, in a tone that was balanced carefully between professional information and something more particular. "The division structure makes sense for where the company is going. The leadership appointments reflect—" She paused. "They reflect where the talent is." He held her gaze. "All right." A beat. "Go drink your coffee," she said. "I'll see you at 2. He went and drank his coffee. His hands, he noted, were entirely steady, which he took as evidence that he was either more composed than he felt or more practiced at compartmentalization than was probably healthy. The 2 o'clock meeting confirmed what the email had implied. Victoria laid out the restructuring with the same methodical precision she brought to any significant communication. The rationale, the structure, the timeline, the implications for each team. She answered questions directly and without the kind of corporate hedge language that made people feel like the real information was being withheld. When someone asked about job security, she said plainly that the restructuring was an expansion, not a reduction, and that every person in the room had a defined role in the new structure. She did not announce the managing director appointment. That was pending board ratification, she said. Friday. The meeting ended. People moved back to their desks with the particular energized uncertainty that follows significant organizational news. Not quite anxious, not quite excited, occupying the space between. Ethan sat at his desk and worked on the Westfield Phase 2 specifications that were due the following week and did not, with considerable effort, spend the rest of the afternoon speculating. He picked up Lily. He made dinner. Lily told him about Bee, who had declared at preschool that day that purple was no longer her favorite color and was now exclusively committed to orange, which Lily found philosophically troubling. "She just changed," Lily said. "Like that?" "People change their minds sometimes," Ethan said, "but purple is better than orange." "That's a matter of opinion." Lily considered this with a 4-year-old's fundamental discomfort with relativism. "No, it isn't," she decided. He did not argue. He did the bear voice without being asked, and Lily fell asleep mid-sentence, which was the best possible outcome to any given evening. He sat at the kitchen table afterward and looked at his phone and thought about Friday. Friday came with the particular quality of days you've been waiting for, which is that they arrive exactly like every other day. Coffee, traffic, the ordinary mechanics of a morning, and refuse to acknowledge their own significance until the moment that actually matters. His desk phone rang at 11:17. "Ethan," Victoria's assistant. "Victoria would like to see you, her office, when you have a moment." "I'll be right there," he said. He walked to her office. He knocked on the open door. She looked up from her desk. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He had sat across from her in this office before, for reviews, for project discussions, for the occasional direct conversation about work that required more than a hallway. The office was ordered and sparsely decorated, one large window behind her desk facing the city. He'd noticed, the first time he'd been in it, that she had exactly 3 personal items in the room. A small plant on the windowsill that had clearly survived considerable neglect, a photograph on the far corner of her desk that he'd never seen clearly, and a single architectural sketch pinned to the wall beside the bookcase that looked like it might be a student project, unfinished and raw. He'd never asked about any of them. The board ratified the divisional structure yesterday evening, she said. She had a folder in front of her, closed. The leadership appointments were confirmed this morning. Okay, he said. Managing Director, Commercial and Civic Division. She met his eyes directly. They approved the recommendation. A breath. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The role comes with a significant increase in scope and accountability. You'll have direct budget authority, your own reporting structure, a team that you'll be building partially from existing staff and partially from new hires. It's a different job than the one you have now. I understand that. Do you want it? He looked at her. The question was direct in the way she was always direct, but underneath it something else. Not quite uncertainty, but the particular quality of someone who has asked a question whose answer they actually care about for more than one reason. Yes, he said. I want it. She nodded. She opened the folder. There's paperwork. The formal offer letter, the compensation structure, the transition timeline. HR will walk you through the benefits adjustments. She slid the folder across the desk. The effective date is May 1st. That gives you 3 weeks of transition with your current team lead. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. Victoria, he said. She looked back at him. The professional composure was intact. Everything was professionally intact, except for the half-second where something moved in her expression, something careful, something that had been managed for a long time and was now encountering a changed set of conditions. Because they both understood what the managing director appointment meant in the specific architecture of their situation. Not just professionally. The thing they'd agreed not to pursue because she was his direct superior. The ethical obstacle, the imbalance, the dynamic that 240 people depended on being managed correctly. That structure was changing. Not gone, not simple, but fundamentally different. He would report to the board through her, yes, but he would no longer be her employee in the direct, daily sense that had made everything they'd both admitted to each other categorically impossible. She knew that. He knew she knew. Take the weekend to review the offer, she said. It was the professional response. The correct professional response. Any questions on the terms, HR can address them Monday. Okay, he said. He stood. He took the folder. He was at the door when she said his name, Ethan, and he turned. She was looking at him from behind her desk, and for a moment the composure wasn't all the way in place, and he could see something underneath it that he recognized because he'd been looking at it and away from it for the better part of a year. Congratulations, she said. You earned it. Thank you, he said. And then because they had spent a year being honest with each other, even when honesty was difficult, he added, for all of it. She held his gaze for a second, then she nodded once and looked back at her desk. He walked out. He accepted the offer Monday morning. He submitted the signed paperwork to HR, shook hands with the team lead who had been his direct manager for the past year, and returned to his desk to begin the transition documentation. Marcus leaned over immediately. Well, I'm taking it. Obviously, you're taking it. Marcus leaned back. Managing Director, you've been here 14 months. 13. That's even more obnoxious. But he was grinning. Congratulations, man. Genuinely. Thank you. Does this mean you get a corner office? I get a different floor. Different floor. Marcus processed this. Are you going to become one of those people who I only see in the elevator? You'll still see me, Ethan said. You're on my team. Marcus blinked. What? I have staffing authority. I want you as senior project lead for the division. He looked at his screen. If you want it. Marcus was quiet for a moment, long enough that Ethan looked over. Yeah, Marcus said. Yeah, I want it. Good. There's a conversation with HR in your future. Marcus turned back to his screen, and Ethan could see him working to keep his expression neutral, which he was not entirely succeeding at. All right, Marcus said. All right then. They worked for the rest of the morning in the comfortable silence of people who have arrived at something they're both satisfied about but don't need to perform. The 3 weeks of transition were busy in the particular productive way of periods where everything is simultaneously ending and beginning. Ethan handed off his current project responsibilities, began the organizational work of building the division's structure, met with the department heads who would now report to him, and started the hiring process for 2 new senior positions. It was more work than he was accustomed to, different work, managerial in a way that required a different set of skills than design work. And he found, with some surprise, that he was good at it, or at least adequate at it in ways that suggested he could become good at it. He saw Victoria in the building the way he always saw her, in meetings that now had a different cast, in hallways, occasionally in the small kitchen. The relationship had shifted structurally, but the day-to-day rhythms of proximity hadn't changed overnight. She was still the CEO. He was now the head of a division. The specific power dynamic between them was different, but not dissolved. Nothing as clean as that. What was different was the air. He noticed it. He thought she noticed it too from the way she managed it, still professional, still correct, but with a quality of deliberateness to the correctness that hadn't been there before, as though she was maintaining a posture rather than simply occupying one. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He knew what he wanted to do with it, and he knew that wanting to do something wasn't the same as it being the right moment to do it. He'd gotten better over the past year at distinguishing between the two. He waited. Not passively. He wasn't good at passive, but with the intentionality of someone who understands that timing is as important as intention. The opportunity arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of April, 3 days before his new role officially began, in the form of a project review that ended early and left him and Victoria alone in the conference room for the first time since December. The other attendees had filed out. He was gathering his materials. She was making a note in the margin of something, and he was about to say goodbye and leave when she looked up. "How's your mother?" she said. He paused, looked at her. "Better. She's good. Fully cleared, back to her regular life." A beat. "She went to a garden club meeting last week and apparently won an argument about soil pH, so I think we can call the recovery complete." Victoria's expression did something that was almost a real smile. "That sounds like complete." "It does." He stood with his folder. "Victoria, I know about the patient services referral." She went still. Not stiffly, just the particular stillness of someone who has been located. "Janet mentioned it," he said, "in February. Told me the referral had come through the company's EAP 2 days after I emailed you." Silence for a moment. "I wasn't trying to," she started. "I know," he said. "That's the thing. I know you weren't trying to make me feel anything about it. That's why you didn't tell me. You just cleared the path." He looked at her. "I've been trying to figure out how to say thank you for that without making it into something uncomfortable." She looked at him steadily. "You don't need to thank me. It was a resource the company offers. I made sure it was accessible." "That's a version of what happened," he said. "It's not the whole version." She didn't argue with that. "I know what you did," he said quietly. "And I know why you did it the way you did it, which was so I wouldn't have to feel like someone had done something for me. Which is exactly the kind of consideration that—" He stopped. He took a breath. "I'm not bringing this up to create a situation. I'm bringing it up because I think you deserve to know that it mattered, that it helped, and that I don't think it was nothing, even if it made more sense for both of us to treat it that way at the time." She looked at him across the conference table. The light from the window was the late afternoon kind, long and angled, and she looked not uncomfortable, but present, very present. The way people look when they're not managing themselves for the benefit of a situation. "Ethan," she said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know the structure is still... I know I'm still part of your organization. I'm not trying to pressure anything." "I know you're not," she said. "That's not..." She paused. Something in her expression was moving, shifting through something. "May 1st is 3 days away." He looked at her. "I know." "Your role changes on May 1st. It does. The reporting structure is different. Yes. She looked down at her notes, then back up at him. I'd like to have dinner, she said. Came out with the careful evenness of someone who has decided to say a thing and is saying it without embellishment. Not a company dinner, not a celebration, just dinner, after May 1st. He held very still for exactly the amount of time it took him to be sure he'd heard correctly. Then, yes, he said, I'd like that. She nodded once, as though a decision had been confirmed. Then she looked back at her notes in a way that meant the conversation was done. Not dismissively, but with the specific quality of someone who has said the thing they needed to say and doesn't need to keep saying it. He gathered his folder. He walked to the door. He was almost through it when he turned back. For the record, he said, I've wanted to ask you to dinner since approximately February of last year. She looked up. That almost smile again, slightly more arrived this time. I know, she said. You knew. Ethan. A brief pause. Go finish your transition documentation. He went. May 1st fell on a Thursday. His first official day as managing director of the Commercial and Civic Division began with a 6:30 alarm, burned oatmeal that he salvaged by switching to toast without ceremony, and Lily declaring that she wanted to wear her purple dress to preschool because it was a special day. How do you know it's a special day? He asked. Because you're wearing a tie, she said. You only wear a tie on special days. He looked down at the tie. Fair point. He dropped Lily at preschool, drove to work, took the elevator to a floor he'd never worked on, and walked into an office that now had his name next to the door on a temporary placard that would be replaced by something permanent next week. He put his bag down. He looked at the office. Modest, clean, a window facing south. Not a corner office, Marcus, but a window. He sat at his desk. He opened his laptop. He had 17 emails and a 9 o'clock with his new direct reports and a budget review scheduled for the afternoon. He worked. Around 11, his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't have saved, but he recognized it immediately because she had sent it from her personal cell, not her work line, which was itself something. Congratulations on day one. How's the view from the new floor? He looked at it for a moment, then he typed back, south-facing, better than expected. 3 dots. Then, Saturday evening, 7 o'clock. There's a place on Clement Street called Reardon's. Low-key. Good food. Do you know it? He did not know it. He typed, I'll find it. See you Saturday. He put his phone face down on his desk and looked at his laptop screen for a moment. Outside his south-facing window, the city went about its business. Cranes against the sky, traffic on the street below. The ordinary constant motion of a place that didn't pause for anyone's personal significance. His 9 o'clock team arrived. He stood, pulled up the agenda, and ran the meeting with the particular focused attention of a person who has decided to be fully present in the thing they're doing rather than half inside the thing that's coming. He was good at the meeting. His team lead, a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who had been skeptical of him at their first meeting 2 weeks ago and was marginally less skeptical now, asked 2 questions that told him she was testing him, and he answered both correctly, and she nodded in a way that meant she was updating her assessment. After the meeting, she stayed behind. You've thought about this structure more carefully than I expected, she said. Not a compliment exactly, an acknowledgement. I've had some time to think about the kind of organization I want this to be, he said. And what kind is that? One where the buildings we design are as good as the process that produces them, where the people in this room make better decisions than any one of us would alone. He looked at her directly. I'm not going to pretend I've done this before. I'm going to rely on the people who have. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said, which, he was already learning, was the Priya Anand version of meaningful approval. He ate lunch at his desk. He handled the budget review. At 6 o'clock, he turned off his laptop and rode the elevator down with 2 people he'd never met before, who turned out to work in the residential division and who congratulated him on the promotion with genuine warmth, and he realized, not for the first time, but with a particular clarity, that this company was full of people who cared about their work, people who would feel the effects of what the leadership of this organization did and didn't do, people who deserved to be led well. He drove to pick up Lily, who came running at him in the preschool pickup line with the full commitment sprint of a person for whom reunions are always the same urgency as the first time. "How was your special day?" she said, grabbing his hand. "Good," he said. "A lot of work." "But good?" "But good." She considered this. "Can we get ice cream? It's 50 degrees." "Ice cream doesn't have a temperature requirement," she said, with the confidence of someone who had given this argument thought. He got her ice cream. She ate it in the car with the intensity of someone who had won a thing, which, all things considered, she had. He drove home through the early evening city, his daughter cheerfully narrating something about B and the orange color situation, the day settling around him into something quieter and more manageable than its beginning had promised. Saturday was 3 days away. He was not going to spend 3 days being anxious about Saturday. He was going to work and take care of his daughter and go see his mother on Friday, and then on Saturday evening he was going to drive to a place on Clement Street called Reardon's and have dinner with a woman who had looked at his work 14 months ago and said yes. He'd figure out the rest from there. That had always been how he worked, not with a plan extending to the horizon, just the next thing, clearly seen, taken seriously. He could do that. He pulled into his parking space. Lily had talked herself into near sleep, the ice cream long finished, her head tipped against the window with the soft surrender of children who fight sleep until they simply stop fighting. He sat for a moment in the quiet car, the city around him, his daughter's small, even breathing. He thought about Victoria saying Saturday evening, 7 o'clock, in the particular tone of someone who had made a decision after a long time of deciding. He thought about the elevator 14 months ago. A cardboard tube and a woman who took one end without asking twice. He thought about everything that had happened between that moment and this one. The work, the confession, the conference room, his mother's surgery, February parking garages, the weight of what they'd been careful about, and the weight of what they'd carried separately, and the weight of what she'd done without asking him to notice. It was a lot of weight, but it had built into something. That was the thing about load-bearing structures. The weight wasn't the enemy. The weight was what made the thing solid, if you built it right. He unbuckled Lily gently. She stirred, but didn't wake. He carried her upstairs, one arm under her knees, her head against his shoulder, the familiar particular weight of a sleeping child who trusts you completely. He put her in bed. He put the blanket over her. He put Gerald back on the nightstand where he belonged. He stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark. Then he turned off the light and went to face the rest of it. Reardon's was the kind of place that didn't try. That was the first thing Ethan noticed when he pushed open the door on Saturday evening, the deliberate absence of effort toward atmosphere. No curated lighting, no music chosen by someone with opinions about music, no menu designed to signal sophistication. Just a room that had been a restaurant for a long time and had settled comfortably into that fact. Dark wood booths, a bar along one wall, the smell of something braised, a chalkboard with the specials written in handwriting that suggested whoever wrote it had other things on their mind. He liked it immediately. Victoria was already there. Of course she was. She was in a corner booth near the back, not facing the door, the opposite of the power position choice, which he noticed and filed away as meaningful in the specific way that small things become meaningful when you've been paying attention to someone for over a year. She had a glass of red wine and was reading something on her phone, and she looked, for the first time in his experience of her, entirely like a person who was not at work. She was wearing a dark green sweater. Her hair was down. He had never seen her hair down before. He stood just inside the door for 1 second longer than necessary, then crossed the room. She looked up. "You found it." "I found it." He slid into the booth across from her. "You've been here before." "A few times. My college roommate lived in this neighborhood. We used to come here when I was in the city." She set her phone down. "It doesn't try to be anything." "That's exactly what I thought when I walked in." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was open in a way her expressions at the office never quite were. Not guarded, not managed, just present. He'd seen flashes of it over the past year. This was the full version. "Hi," she said, simply. "Hi," he said back. The waiter came. Ethan ordered wine he didn't look at the label of. They looked at the menu, which was short and sensible, and ordered without deliberation. She got the braised short rib. He got the roasted chicken, and neither of them made it into a conversation because it didn't need to be. And then they just talked, not about work, or rather, not primarily about work, not in the way their conversations had always been organized around a project or a decision or a professional context. They talked the way people talk when the scaffolding comes down, sideways, associatively, following threads without knowing where they'd end up. She told him about her college roommate, who was now a marine biologist in New Zealand, and sent her photographs of things that lived at unreasonable ocean depths. He told her about his college roommate, who had been spectacularly irresponsible with money and was now inexplicably a financial advisor in Phoenix. She laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that arrived without the half-second delay of social laughter. He hadn't heard her laugh like that before. It did something to the room. "What were you like in college?" she asked. "Serious," he said. "Probably too serious. I cared about architecture in the way you care about things when you're 20 and you think caring hard enough will make you automatically good at them." "Did it work?" "Some of it. The caring was real, which helped. The arrogance took longer to sort out." "Were you arrogant?" He thought about it honestly. "About the work, yes. I thought good ideas were sufficient on their own. I was slow to understand that execution and collaboration mattered as much as the idea. Maybe more." She nodded. "What changed that?" "A professor who dismantled a project I was very proud of in front of the entire studio." He paused. "And Sophie. She was better with people than I was. She pointed out more than once, and with increasing directness, that I was treating my ideas like they were self-evidently important instead of making them important to other people." He said Sophie's name without the particular internal brace that he'd needed for so long, and Victoria received it without the careful delicacy that most people brought to the subject. She just listened. "She sounds like she was sharp," Victoria said. "She was. A beat. She would have had opinions about you." "Good or bad?" "Good, I think. She respected people who took their work seriously without making it their entire personality." He looked at his wine. "She also would have pointed out that you make me nervous in a way I don't usually let show." Victoria regarded him across the table. "You don't seem nervous." "I've had a year of practice at not seeming nervous." Something shifted in her expression, something that was close to being moved, held back just slightly. "I've made things difficult for you," she said. "This year, I know that." "You made things correct," he said. "There's a difference." "I'm not sure the distinction was entirely painless from your end." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." He looked at her directly. "Was it from yours?" A pause. She turned her wine glass by the stem, once, a small rotation. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Neither of them said anything for a moment. The restaurant moved around them. A couple at the next booth, the low sound of the bar, the waiter delivering something to a table across the room. "I've spent a lot of years," Victoria said slowly, "making professional decisions that prioritize the company over the personal. Not because the personal didn't exist, because I decided early on that the company had to come first, or it didn't come at all. My father built it. The people in it depend on it." She paused. "I don't regret that. But I think I let it become a habit that extended further than it needed to." "How far?" he asked. She looked at him. "Far enough that I almost convinced myself that the most sensible thing was to keep things exactly the way they were, indefinitely." "What changed your mind?" "May 1st, she said, and then quieter. "And the fact that almost convincing yourself is not the same as actually convincing yourself." The food arrived. They ate. The short rib was good, genuinely good. The unself-conscious good of a restaurant that has been making the same thing for years and has gotten it right. He told her so, and she agreed, and they talked about food for a while in the specific pleasant way of two people who have other things on their minds, but are also actually eating dinner and see no reason not to enjoy it. Somewhere around the middle of the meal, with the wine at a level that had made things easier without making them imprecise, she asked him about Lily. Not the way people asked about Lily as a social obligation. The polite single question, the nod, the subject change. She asked specifically, with the quality of someone who actually wanted to know. "Tell me about her," she said. "Not the logistics. Actually, tell me about her. He looked at her for a moment. Then he talked about Lily, about the negotiating, about Gerald the ceramic reindeer and the position by the window, about the purple dress and the ice cream argument, and the way she'd declared that 5-year-olds could absolutely care for kittens and had been compiling evidence toward this claim for 2 months, about the drawings on the nightstand, about the bear voice, about the way she'd held Carol's hand at the hospital and read her the wrong voices with total confidence, and Carol had listened without complaint, which was the most remarkable thing he'd witnessed all year. Victoria listened to all of it, not with the social smile people wore when you talked about your kids, with actual attention, the kind that processed and engaged and occasionally asked a follow-up question that meant she'd been listening carefully enough to want to know more. She sounds like someone with a complete interior life, Victoria said. She's 4. She has an extremely complete interior life. She's also completely unreasonable on multiple fronts. That tracks for 4. Does it? I have nothing to compare to. I was unreasonable at 4, she said. My mother has documentation. He laughed. The ease of it surprised him slightly. Not the laugh itself, but the way it arrived without effort, without the layer of management he'd been applying to their interactions for so long. She'd like you, he said, about Lily. He said it simply, without loading it with implication, because he meant it simply. She likes people who take things seriously. She can tell the difference, even at 4. Victoria looked at him across the table. I'd like to meet her, she said, when it makes sense, when it's appropriate, and when you're comfortable. He held her gaze. Okay, he said. Not right away, she added. I know how these things work, or how they should work. Lily is the priority in that equation, not, I know you know that, he said. You don't have to explain it. She stopped, nodded. All right. They finished dinner, they had coffee, which neither of them really needed but both wanted as an extension of the evening. The waiter cleared the table without hurry and refilled the water and left them alone, as good waiters do when they understand the room. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Yes. What was it? Specifically, when did you... He paused. At Calder's, when I said what I said. You didn't look surprised. Not really. She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't, she said. Not entirely. How long had you known? She looked at him with the particular directness that was just her. Not calculated, not deflecting, just honest. Long enough that I'd already had the conversation with myself about why it couldn't go anywhere. A pause. Which is not the same as not feeling it. It just meant I'd already done the work of talking myself down before you ever said anything out loud. And when I said it out loud, I had to redo all the work, she said, with a dryness that was almost rueful. From scratch. He laughed. She laughed. It was the most uncomplicated moment they'd had in over a year, and it arrived like something released. They walked out together into the May evening, which had the mild quality of the city finally deciding to be kind after a long winter. The street was moderately busy. Saturday evening people, couples, someone walking a very large dog with the confidence of someone who had committed to the dog despite all evidence against it. They stood on the sidewalk outside Riordan's, the natural moment where the evening either continued or concluded, and neither of them had declared which. I'm parked 2 blocks north, she said. I'm south, he said. A beat. This was... he started. Good, she said. It was good. Yes. He looked at her. Can we do it again? Yes, she said. Not after a pause, just directly, the way she said things when she'd already decided. Next weekend? I have a board dinner Friday. She considered. Sunday. Sunday? He said. I'll find somewhere that doesn't try. The edge of a real smile. Good criteria. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. There was a specific quality to the moment, not awkward, not charged in the uncomfortable way, just weighted with the particular significance of a beginning that had been a long time arriving. He thought about the elevator. He thought about 14 months of the most careful, deliberate emotional containment he'd ever practiced. He thought about his kitchen table at 2 a.m, doing math, and his mother in the hospital bed, and a parking garage in February, and a conference room in December, and Calder's and the cardboard tube. He thought about all of it adding up to this sidewalk, this evening, this woman looking at him with an expression that was no longer being managed. He leaned forward and kissed her, briefly, on the cheek. Not declarative, not a statement, just present, just real. She went very still for half a second. Then she looked at him with something that was quiet and certain and entirely unguarded. "Sunday," she said. "Sunday," he said. She walked north. He walked south. The May night continued around him, indifferent and mild, and he walked to his car feeling like a man who had finally stopped holding his breath. What came after was not a fairy tale. He would say that clearly if anyone asked, and eventually people did ask, and he said it. It was two people with complicated lives trying to build something honest while the rest of the world had opinions about it. The opinions came quickly. That was the thing about relationships inside organizations. They didn't stay private, and you had to decide in advance how you were going to handle that, because handling it after the fact was always worse. Within 6 weeks of that Saturday at Reardon's, it was known. Not announced, not broadcast, known, in the way things are known in workplaces, through the particular osmosis of people who spend 40 hours a week in proximity to each other, and are very good at reading the air. The response was not uniform. Some people were fine with it, understood the new reporting structure, understood that the dynamic had changed, respected the professionalism with which both of them continued to operate. Marcus fell into this category without requiring explanation. He mentioned it exactly once, in passing, said, "About time," with the tone of a man who had been waiting for this resolution for the better part of a year, and then returned to the Westfield Phase 2 specifications without further comment. Priya Anand, Ethan's deputy director, who by midsummer had evolved from skeptical to genuinely invested in the division's work, acknowledged it to Ethan directly in the matter-of-fact way she acknowledged everything. "I assume you've thought through the professional implications." He said he had. She said, "Good," and moved on. That was Priya Anand's version of endorsement. Others were less straightforward about it. There was a member of the board, a man named Harwick, 60-something, who had been on Langford's board since before Victoria took over, who requested a meeting with Victoria specifically to raise concerns about perceived conflicts of interest. Victoria told Ethan about this conversation afterward, over dinner at his apartment, sitting on his kitchen floor because the table was covered in Lily's art project and neither of them had moved it. "What did you tell him?" Ethan asked. "I told him the reporting structure was established before the relationship began, that the division operates independently with its own accountability framework, and that my personal life is my personal life as long as it doesn't compromise the integrity of the company's operations." She considered her wine. "I also told him that if he had specific governance concerns, he was welcome to raise them formally with the full board, and that I'd welcome that conversation." "Did he raise them formally?" "No." "Why not?" "Because he doesn't actually have a governance argument. He has a preference. Those aren't the same thing." She paused. "He'll watch for a while. People do. That's fine." Ethan looked at her. "Does this bother you? People watching?" She thought about it honestly. "It used to bother me more than it does now. I spent a long time..." A pause. "I spent a long time running the company in a way that was above reproach in every direction, including personal directions that had nothing to do with reproach. And I think some of that was legitimate and some of it was..." She stopped. "Some of it was using the company as a reason not to do things that scared me." He looked at her. "Did I scare you?" "A little," she said, with the directness that was entirely characteristic. The specific version of scared that comes from something being real. She met his eyes. "It's different from the general version." "Yeah," he said. "I know." Lily chose this moment to emerge from her bedroom with a drawing she'd completed, which she presented to Victoria with the gravity of someone offering a significant gift. Victoria received it with equal seriousness. It was a drawing of 3 figures of varying heights, labeled in Lily's evolving handwriting: Daddy, Lily, and, after a moment's examination, Vicky. Ethan looked at it. He looked at Victoria. Victoria was looking at the drawing with an expression that had nothing managed about it at all. "That's beautiful," Victoria said to Lily. "You're the tallest," Lily said, indicating the largest figure. Because you're important. Am I? Lily considered. Daddy says important people make hard decisions. She paused. Do you make hard decisions? Sometimes, Victoria said. Does it make you sad? A beat. Sometimes, Victoria said again, but sometimes it's the right thing anyway. Lily absorbed this with the processing speed of a 5-year-old encountering a concept she would return to later. Then, do you want to see my room? Victoria looked at Ethan. He shrugged, the shrug of a man who had learned not to stand between Lily and a decision she'd made. Sure, Victoria said. She went to see Lily's room. Ethan sat on the kitchen floor and looked at the drawing. Daddy, Lily, Vicky, and felt something that didn't have a clean name, but that settled in him like something finding the place it had been looking for. The board's scrutiny faded by autumn, not because anyone had declared it over, but because the division performed, concretely, visibly, in ways that produced results the board understood. The Westfield project, fully into Phase 2 by July, was being cited by 2 city planning publications as a model for equitable mixed-use development. 2 new contracts came in before the end of Q3. Ethan's team, which he'd built with the same care he brought to load-bearing structures, was functioning with the cohesion of people who trusted each other's work. The company was doing well. His division was doing well. The relationship between the CEO and the managing director was, from the outside, professional and appropriate, because from the inside it was professional and appropriate. They had decided, without making it a dramatic conversation, that they were going to do this correctly or not at all, that transparency and performance were the only defenses against legitimate scrutiny, and that legitimate scrutiny was something they could live with. It was not perfect. Nothing about it was perfect. There were weeks where the work pressure compressed everything else, where they saw each other primarily as colleagues and had to consciously carve out the space to be something else. There were dinners that ended in argument, not dramatic argument, but the low-grade friction of 2 people with strong opinions about things who hadn't yet entirely mapped each other's particular sensitivities. He was too prone to internalizing problems. She was too prone to solving them before checking whether he wanted them solved. He sometimes needed her to just listen. She sometimes needed him to actually tell her that. They were learning. That was the word for it. Learning each other, the way you have to actually learn a person if what you're building is going to hold weight. He introduced her to his mother in September. Carol received Victoria with an expression that was entirely neutral, and therefore, Ethan knew from 32 years of reading it, primarily cautious. They sat at Carol's kitchen table and talked for 2 hours, and Carol asked Victoria the kind of questions that sounded like ordinary conversation and were actually small calibrated assessments, and Victoria answered them with the direct honesty that was simply how she was built. And at the end of the afternoon, Carol walked Victoria to the door and said, loud enough for Ethan to hear from the kitchen, "You're straightforward. I appreciate that. Ethan tends to let things build up. He's going to need someone who makes him say things out loud." Victoria said, "I know. I'm working on it." Carol made a sound of considered approval and closed the door. Ethan stood in the kitchen pretending he hadn't heard any of that. Victoria came back in and looked at him. "Your mother is very direct." "She is. It runs in the family. Only partially," he said. "I took longer to get there." "You got there," she said. He had. He thought about the elevator, 14 months of careful containment, a Friday night at Calder's when something simply ran out of room to stay unexpressed. He had gotten there, in the least graceful, most human way possible, by holding on too long and then letting go all at once, by saying a true thing before he was ready to say it, by spending a year in the productive discomfort of not knowing how it ended. The night Ethan thought of as the real ending, or the real beginning, depending on how you faced it, was a Thursday in October, 8 months after the first Saturday at Reardon's. He and Victoria were on the rooftop of the Langford Development Building. She had a key to the roof access, a holdover from the early days of running the company, when she'd come up here to think and no one had asked her to explain it. She'd shown it to him in August, the way you show someone a private place when you've decided they're allowed into the private parts of your life. The city moved below them in the October dark. You could see 3 districts from up here: The waterfront, where the Westfield project was under construction, the older Midtown grid, the neighborhoods spreading south toward the suburbs, where his mother was presumably doing something with her garden and winning arguments about soil pH. He'd been up here a handful of times. Each time it was different, because light and season did different things to a fixed view, which was something he'd understood intellectually as an architect and kept relearning as an experience. Victoria was beside him, her shoulder close to his, not quite touching. They'd had dinner before coming up, takeout from a Vietnamese place she'd discovered 3 weeks ago, and had been insisting he try ever since, and were in that post-dinner state of comfortable surplus, not needing to fill the air. The Westfield Phase 3 approval came through today, she said. I saw. The City Planning Board had no significant objections. 2 minor revision requests, both manageable. I know, Marcus handled the briefing. He paused. I heard you advocated for the revised community access framework in the planning committee meeting. Someone had to. The committee was inclined to defer to the commercial footprint. Thank you for that. It was the right call. Yes, he said. But you made it. She was quiet for a moment. Below them, the city's ordinary luminescence, traffic lights, apartment windows, the string of amber along the waterfront road. I've been thinking about something, she said. What? She looked at him. Lily asked me last week if I was going to be around for a long time. He turned toward her. She did? She asked in the specific way where it wasn't exactly a question. It was more like she was checking whether I understood what the right answer was. Victoria paused. She's very sophisticated for 5. She's extremely sophisticated for 5. It's occasionally alarming. What did you tell her? He asked. I told her I planned to be. She held his eyes. I meant it. He looked at her for a moment, at the city below. At the Westfield site in the distance, cranes dark against the sky, the frame of something rising. She's going to need time, he said, to actually trust that. Not because she won't want to, she already wants to, but she's lost someone. She understands that people go. He paused. I need you to know that going in, that the timeline might be longer than it would be otherwise, and that her needs have to come first in it. I know, Victoria said. I know that, Ethan. I'm not asking to skip that part. I'm saying I want to be there for it. A pause. All of it. The slow part. The long part. He stood with that for a moment. The thing she was saying was not small. She was not a person who said things she didn't mean, and she was especially not a person who said things like, I want to be there for all of it, without having already sat with the full weight of what all of it contained. He knew that. He believed it in the particular way you believe things about people when you've watched them in their actual life, under actual pressure, handling actual difficulty. He trusted her. That was the bottom of it. Not blindly, not without the knowledge that trust was a thing that had to be maintained and renewed and occasionally repaired, but genuinely on the basis of evidence, in the way that a structure trusts its foundation, because the foundation has held weight before and you've checked the engineering. Okay, he said. Okay? Okay, he said again. And then, I love you. He had not planned to say it tonight, but it arrived the way true things arrived for him. Not dramatically, not with a run-up, just at the moment when it ran out of room to stay unsaid. Victoria looked at him. Something moved through her expression. Surprise. And beneath the surprise, something that had been there for a while and was only now being allowed to show fully. She exhaled, slow. I love you, she said back. Steady, certain, in the tone she used for things she'd already decided. The city continued below them. The cranes at Westfield were still against the sky. Somewhere south of here, his mother's house sat in the suburban dark. Somewhere in his apartment, Lily was asleep with Gerald on her nightstand, her drawings accumulating on the walls, her world expanding in the daily ordinary way of children who feel safe enough to let it. He put his arm around Victoria. She leaned into it slightly. Not dramatically, not like a movie, just the small physical adjustment of a person allowing themselves to be close. They stood like that for a while, looking at the city, not talking. He thought about Sophie. He thought about her honestly and without guilt, about the fact that grief and love were not a fixed economy, that what you felt for the people who came after didn't diminish what you'd felt for the ones who came before. He thought about what she'd said, repeatedly and with increasing directness, about his tendency to let things build up instead of saying them out loud. He thought that she would have recognized in the woman standing beside him someone who brought a similar kind of pressure, the kind that made you actually say things. He thought he'd finally learned, or was learning, the way you learn the things that matter, slowly, through repetition, through getting it wrong and coming back. He thought about what it meant to build something, not just professionally, not just the structures that held weight and shaped the way people moved through the world, but the other kind of building, the kind that didn't have a blueprint and couldn't be specified in advance and required you to keep showing up to the site even when the progress wasn't visible yet. He'd been doing that. So had she. For a long time, separately and now together, with all the difficulty and imprecision that together entailed. It wasn't the life he'd planned. He'd planned a different life, with a different person, and that plan had ended on a roadside 3 years ago on a night he never fully allowed himself to return to. But this was the life he'd built from what remained. And what remained had turned out, in the slow accumulation of ordinary days and difficult months, and small true things said at the wrong moment and the right moment, to be more than enough. More than he'd been confident of, in the years when confidence had been hard to find. Below them, the city pulsed with its ordinary urgent life. People going somewhere, returning from somewhere. Buildings holding their weight. Lights in windows where ordinary, complicated lives were taking place. He stood on the roof in the October dark with a woman who had looked at his work before she knew his name and said yes, and who had then, over the course of 14 months of the most careful, honest, inconvenient love he'd ever been part of, found ways to say yes to the rest of him too. That was the thing about foundations. You didn't see them. They weren't the part of the building that caught the eye or made the photographs. But everything that stood upright, everything that bore weight, everything that lasted, it started there, with the thing underneath that held. He had that now. He was going to do right by it. On a Sunday morning in November, 6 weeks after the rooftop, Lily came into the kitchen where Ethan was making breakfast, slightly burned as usual because some things didn't change, and announced that she needed to ask him something important. "Okay," he said, turning down the burner. Lily climbed onto her chair with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this. "Is Victoria going to be our family?" He looked at his daughter. She looked back at him with Sophie's eyes and her own particular directness that she had arrived at by herself, from some combination of genetics and the specific life she'd been living. He sat down across from her. He thought about how to answer honestly and completely and at a 5-year-old's altitude. "She's going to be part of our family," he said, "not the same as Mommy. Nobody is the same as Mommy, but her own thing, something new." Lily considered this. "Something new isn't bad," she said. "No," he agreed, "it isn't. Bee's family got a new baby, and she says it's actually pretty good once you get used to it." "That's a useful data point." Lily turned this over. "Gerald likes her," she said finally, with the tone of a decisive argument. He looked at the ceramic reindeer which had migrated over the course of the autumn from Lily's nightstand to the kitchen windowsill, positioned as always so he could see outside. "That does seem relevant," Ethan said. "It's very relevant," Lily said. "Gerald has good judgment." He looked at his daughter, who was 5 years old and had decided that a ceramic reindeer had good judgment and was using this as her primary evidence in a question about family structure. And he thought, she is going to be exactly fine. Complicated, strong-willed, occasionally unreasonable about temperature requirements for ice cream, entirely her own person. Exactly fine. He got up and saved the eggs from the edge of burning and put them on 2 plates and called it breakfast. Lily ate without complaint. Outside the kitchen window, the November morning was gray and mild, and the city was waking up to its ordinary weekend business, and Gerald sat on the windowsill where he could see outside, as he always had. Some things you hold on to, not because they're grand, because they're yours. That was the whole of it, Ethan thought, looking at his daughter across the kitchen table. The whole lesson of the past 3 years, if he was honest enough to name it. You lose things. You keep going. You show up and you do the work, and you say the true things even when the timing is terrible. and you let the people who want to help you actually help you. You don't mistake maintaining dignity for being alone. You don't mistake patience for passivity. You build carefully and you check the load-bearing walls. And when something is solid enough to hold weight, you let it hold weight. And sometimes, not always, not tidily, not according to any plan you would have written for yourself. You find that what you've built is big enough for more than one person. Sometimes it's big enough for three.